All right. Well, this is going to be a fun lecture. There's probably not a better lens through which to look at the early periods of American Christianity than through the life of Jonathan Edwards. We have four basic categories here. His early life, and then we'll talk about the First Great Awakening, which just overlaps with his life tremendously. The drama he experienced and his experiences in his later years in Northampton, that's in Western Massachusetts, and then finally his later years. Now, Jonathan Edwards is generally regarded to be the most profound American theologian of all time, and often the most profound American philosopher of all time. So his overall impact on these fields, I mean, those are two fields that to be a notable individual in either would be rather remarkable, but to be so in both, and of course, as well, to be a minister his entire life, he's a remarkable person, and so we'll jump right into his life. I'll just try to put things into perspective for you. Edwards, his lifetime, roughly early 1700s. He doesn't live nearly as long as he could have. I actually think I made it go too far. I don't know if he actually made it this far. I think this line might be a little too long. But in any case, he does not live much past his 50s, and I think he died younger than that, and I'm a little disappointed at my timeline here. Let me see. He's born, I got it right here, 1703, okay. But to put it in perspective, the Great Awakening is this period roughly from 1730 to 1755. Now, awakening to what? We'll talk in greater depths, but the shorter answer is, if you remember the final part of our last lecture, very shortly into the American project, these Puritans who went to America looking for religious freedom actually become pretty backslidden in their Christian conviction. And so many of us have this idea that in the old days, everybody was God-fearing, everybody served the Lord, everybody believed. But in fact, there was a great decline in Christian faith in the years leading up to this, which makes for a time where a great awakening to the reality of sin, the reality of death, the reality of a final judgment, and the need for salvation in Christ has to come about. And it's roughly counted to be a 25-year period. In Jonathan Edwards, as you can see, he lives through it. These other references we're going to talk about in our next lecture next week, but this is telling you what's going on in the Presbyterian church. Presbyterians come on a little bit later. When do the Pilgrims come over? Anybody remember the date? 1620. There we go. Homeschool mom from the corner. That's right. So Presbyterians don't come on in America for just about 100 years. And so in Philadelphia, you have the first Presbyterian in 1709, and then the Log College is going to be the beginnings of Princeton, which is a Presbyterian institution. And of course, you'll have a split between different schools of Presbyterians in the middle of the Great Awakening about what to do with it and how to respond to it and what side you're on. Of course, all of this precedes the Revolutionary War, which is going to come about in these years between 1775 and 1783. And this is, of course, going to be the birthing and the formation of our country, 1789, U.S. Constitution. One historian puts it this way, a great biographer of Jonathan Edwards. He says the first American Revolution was not the American Revolution. It was the Great Awakening. And the point is that this is going to shape religion in America in a fashion that we are all still feeling the ripples of it. And so, without further ado, life of Jonathan Edwards. Edwards is born into a family in New England with 10 sisters. And Jonathan is the beloved boy of the group. And he's born to Timothy Edwards and Esther Stoddard. We're going to talk about these names. But the way you've got to understand New England in this period is that it's a highly aristocratic society. We are, for the first time in human history, headed toward a place where we can begin to build what we now know as the middle class. And that's where there are a lot of people who are relatively comfortable in the world. And we're headed in that direction, but an aristocracy points you to the fact that there are still prominent families who kind of run everything. And don't get me wrong, everybody's better off than when they were a serf in England or somewhere in Europe. But Edwards comes from an aristocratic family that isn't high aristocracy, as we're going to see. Stoddard surely is. The Mathers, who we talked about last week, Increase and Cotton, high aristocracy. but the Edwards they're on the list, they're on the scale. And here's the thing you've got to understand about Jonathan Edwards' father, Timothy. Timothy Edwards believes that one of the fundamental responsibilities of a minister is to be able to gauge the genuineness of his sheep's conversion, that they've really believed. Now, why would he have this idea? Obviously, you're coming off of centuries of what you might consider purely formal religion in Rome, purely formal religion even in the Anglican Church, where people are showing up to church, going through the motions, going home, and they're Anglican because they did that. The question that we're going to ask in the course of this lecture is if he falls too far off on the other side. It would be a really challenging thing for me personally if I felt like it was my job to peer into your souls and be able to definitively determine whether your faith was real. Sometimes, when we have, backslidden seasons in our own life, there are people, I've had many, many counseling sessions with people who go, I'm not sure if my faith is real, my conversion is real, my Christianity is real. Now, we'll talk more about that issue and that general concept, but here's the thing. In the Edwards Church, where he grew up in East Windsor, Connecticut, there was a revival in 1715. Now, you'll see how revivalism goes along with this. People who maybe have had relatively stale religion, I'm Christian, but don't really show much excitement about it or joy about it. Well, when revival comes, many of those people display outwardly in extreme emotional responses that they either believe the gospel or they're really genuinely burdened by their sin. And it's the sort of thing that someone like Timothy Edwards would say, now I have confidence that you really believe this thing. And you can have greater confidence having had this real moment of conversion. Now, I want to say one other thing about conversion, because even the way I phrased it a moment ago didn't quite do it justice. On a Puritan scheme, your conversion is not so much like what you do at the end of a Billy Graham crusade and go up and, have an altar call experience. It's more like what you read about in the Pilgrim's Progress. Anybody read that book? Pilgrim's Progress is a story about a man's spiritual bout of faith, his pursuit of a celestial city. It's a big allegory, and at various points he gets drawn off the path. And his story of conversion is that life of battle in the name of Christ, and for the kingdom, in pursuit of the kingdom, that is an experience that's different from, I was baptized in infancy, and since then I've never really thought twice about Christianity. That person has no conversion experience. They have no life of faith and battle. And do you see the difference between those two things, like a one-time deal and a course of obedience? Well, I just want to show you in the map real quick where this is all at. East Windsor, this is where he's going to grow up, and he's going to go to school down here in New Haven. Anybody know what Ivy League school is in New Haven, Connecticut? Yale. And at the time, it was not called Yale, but that's really what it is. This is the precursor to Yale. It's just called the Collegiate School. So this is the second major training institution in America after Harvard. And part of the reason it got formed is because Harvard, everybody was feeling like had gone soft, had gone liberal. Anybody have some Christian school they can think of right now that they're kind of mad that it's like used to be solid, now it's liberal? This has been the story of Christian institutions from the beginning of American history. Every single Ivy League school started as a training place for pastors. And you wouldn't think of Yale as that now. Well, in any case, Edwards he's very clearly brilliant from a young age. And he is getting exposed to ideas by Isaac Newton. Think about Newtonian physics and a world that is governed by rational laws and mathematical principles and things like that. John Locke is he's going to have vast implications on civil theory and social contract and all of those sorts of things. And he's encountering these ideas. And the family actually has concern for Jonathan's salvation. You think about his dad. He wants to know that you're really having a serious, life and story of conversion and of faith and of battle for your faith. Well, in 1719, that's 3 years into his education, Edwards suffers from pleurisy, which is a sort of, I think, infection in the lungs. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, so a cough, trouble breathing, things like that. Well, after that experience, Edwards has some sense of his finitude, has some sense of the imminence of death, has some sense of the reality of judgment. And through that, Edwards has a pretty radical turn. He tells, as he tells his own story, originally he hated the idea of divine sovereignty. God's in control of everything. You know, the idea at the time felt stuffy and limiting, and this idea, you know, that you're kind of stuck and God's in control and you're not. And he tells this story that, you know, into this conversion experience, understood as we've described it already, he began to love the idea, found it to be the most freeing of all ideas. The idea that in everything God is revealing himself, in everything God's glorifying himself. There's no possibility, failure for God to glorify himself, and he's going to become one of the great Calvinist theologians and thinkers of his time, one of the greatest in American history. Well, even at this young age, Jonathan Edwards' Christian life is not just rational. In fact, we talked, he's had a very emotional encounter with the Lord, and you're going to see that Edwards' theology is not, again, just rational. It's married to a deep, deep piety. And you're going to get that all throughout his story. Even at this young age, he writes up his 70 resolutions. I mean, for 1719, that makes him 16 years old. And it's shortly, I think it's a little bit after the age of 16, but 70 resolutions for how to live. Now, you read these resolutions, and some of them, some of them remind one of the sorts of rules and behaviors that, a monastic community might live by. But they even tend to be more spiritual and pious than just strictly a rule of life, like when you're going to eat and when you're going to sleep. Here are some examples. Resolved that I will do whatsoever I think to be most to God's glory and my own good, profit, and pleasure in the whole of my duration, without any consideration of the time, whether now or never so many myriads of ages hence. He's saying, I will do what I believe works to the glory of God. And he's not just talking about like hedonistic pleasure. This is Westminster Confession or Catechism, question 1. What is the chief end of man? To glorify God and to enjoy him forever. And I'm going to do in any moment, my resolution is to do in any moment what I think is going to contribute to God's glory and my good, regardless of when I can see exactly how that comes about, whether it takes ages for it to come about. And that's kind of a question you're always asking in the moment. Like, what good is this really going to do, right? A witness, you have that one, just what me and Josh were talking about. Is this really going to do any good? He's like, I'm going to do whatever I believe works to God's glory, regardless of the considerations of time. Look at this 23rd one. Anybody want to read that?
Resolved frequently to take some deliberate action, which seems most unlikely to be done for the glory of God, and trace it back to the original intention, designs, and ends of it.
Okay, so here's what he's saying. I want to do things that are totally spontaneous and surprising. Take deliberate actions that would seem even unlikely. Like, you got the favorite place you like to go for lunch? I'm going to intentionally go to this place that I just see it right there, and maybe I'll meet someone else there and have an opportunity to share the gospel. Or maybe I'll have an experience of something of God's creation, some flavor with their food that I've never experienced before, and I'll give glory to God in a different way than I had before. And I'm not just going to do these things, I'm going to do things that are unexpected as an expression of the free sovereignty of God, knowing that even what I'm doing right now is something that God ordained to occur for some end for his glory. And for him, it was like an experiment to participate in a more intentional way in this sublime wisdom and sovereignty of God. Do you guys get that? these are some pretty intense resolutions for someone who's, 16, 17, 18, right? Yes.
Well, that's like when I resolved originally to look into and understand who Jesus was when I was in college.
Yeah.
It wasn't something I was given to do typically.
Right.
And I had determined that I would do that with the idea of putting any prejudice or preconceptions on hold and let the story speak for itself.
Right. So you'd say there's a dramatic likeness to this sort of resolution throughout your Christian life to what it's like to become a Christian in the first place. And so it's just contrary to your former nature to look into Christ with an interest and a resolve to understand him for who he is. But likewise, throughout your life, you can make similar sorts of decisions, and that's what Edwards is resolving to do. Well, Jonathan Edwards, in his young adulthood, and this is where you can chalk one up for the Presbyterians, his first pulpit supply mission was to a Presbyterian church in New York. And he absolutely loved it. And I want to give you just a flavor here. All of the major forms of Christianity in America at this time are, in one sense, the fruit of the Reformed tradition. You're going to have Anglicans, Congregationalists. Remember, they function more like independent churches with the state as the thing that keeps them together. And then, of course, Presbyterians. And they're kind of the Johnny-come-lately on the scene, but they're here. And in New York City, you still have, I put this up here. This right here, one of the oldest buildings in New York City, Etienne de Lancy Mansion, was a French Huguenot who was a French Calvinist. Their polity was essentially Presbyterian, and that was in the city of New York, and he loves it. It's amazing. For a person who believes in and knows the sovereignty of God, and then you see all of the industry and creativity of this place and the opportunity. There really wasn't a city in the world probably quite like New York in the Americas at that time, where the ability of a person who was not an aristocrat or a noble or you name it to have success in life, there was almost nothing like it. And in some ways, you can think about for someone like Edwards, who's going to develop, and he's kind of birthed into a world of post-millennial eschatology, and you have optimism for what is to come. This is going to become something of a symbolism, a symbol for the optimism that we ought to have as Christians and what this new Christian land is forming. Well, in any case, it was a brief stay. He actually would have loved to have taken a pastorate in New York. That's what his biographers say. But he had to go home, and home is just right back to New Haven at this point, and do the commencement speech for Yale for his graduating class. He was, that guy, that valedictorian or whatever they would have called it back then. And the opportunity that does arise, and that his father surely had some connections to help him get, was in a relatively small town called Bolton, Connecticut in 1723. And that's actually where you have the first ministerial call for Jonathan Edwards. And so he heads back up to Bolton here, not too far from his father in East Windsor. Now, it's in this general time when his time in Bolton is actually rather short, and he ends up back at Yale to be a tutor, to engage more academic sorts of things. And that's Edwards' bent. Well, when he gets there, he's had his eye on Sarah Pierpont for a while. And she was quite a bit younger than him when he first took an interest in her. I think she was 16 and he was 21 or something like that. And so basically it was like back then you would have something more like, what do you call that when you have an arranged marriage? What's that? Yeah, you could be betrothed well before you were marryable. So he has an engagement that lasts, that's like 3 years long, 25 to 27. And he experiences an incredible spiritual crisis in this time frame. And no one knows exactly why. I can say I can imagine it being extremely frustrating to be engaged to someone for 3 years, and it strikes me that might contribute to it. But there are other things going on as well. Throughout Edwards' life, there are going to be bouts of depression. And this is kind of a typical story. Luther definitely had bouts of depression. Charles Haddon Spurgeon, the great Baptist preacher, bouts of depression. And there are things going on at Yale, though, too. There is a general sense that at Yale, things are going cold. We've already seen this in Harvard once. The rector of the college, at this point, it's the collegiate college. It's not called Yale yet, but Timothy Cutler, he becomes Anglican. And that's kind of a dagger in the heart of, a congregational Puritan society where the whole point of coming to this country was to get away from these stale forms of worship and to worship according to the scriptures. And so biographers do their best to make sense of exactly what's going on during this spiritual crisis, but it lasts for a while, and it does seem to end when he's able to get married. So it seems like that has something to do with it. But the Edwardses now become a couple, and it's from this point that Edwards is going to have his first ministerial call in Northampton. And to understand the climate of Northampton, you've got to understand the family relations that are there and the man that preceded Jonathan Edwards, Solomon Stoddard. Solomon Stoddard was the unchallenged spiritual head and leader, of Northampton. He had been there for 50 years, half a century, 50-year ministry in this aristocratic society, and you can imagine he was up at the top of the list. Solomon Stoddard, I like this. Yeah, he was called the Puritan Pope of the Connecticut Valley. That was the sort of influence that he had in the sphere that he was in. And I want to set these families next to each other just so you can see something of this aristocracy. You've got the Stoddard family, and Solomon Stoddard, he's actually married to Esther Mather, who's, part of the Mather clan, another highly aristocratic family, so Esther Mather Stoddard. And they produced John Stoddard. And then as you go down, Esther Stoddard here is married to Timothy Edwards, which is Jonathan Edwards' father. So there's this intense connection in this family tree. Jonathan Edwards then is what? He's the grandson of Solomon Stoddard, connected in this line. And of course, we saw how influential the Mathers were when we talked in our last lecture. And so you can see there's a social hierarchy that is strong, it's firm, it's established, and Jonathan Edwards is going to walk into this place. Now remember, Edwards is a highly creative, highly gifted thinker and a man of intense conviction, which means that probably when he gets an idea, when you marry that to intense piety and conviction, it's going to be impossible for him to not stand by that idea. And it's almost inevitable, given the fertile mind that he is, that he's going to have certain ideas that his grandfather didn't. And that is going to be a problem for Edwards in the course of his life, as it is for any thinker, to be honest, who has ideas that others perhaps didn't before them. Well, to understand this whole picture and what's going on, you have to understand the issue of the halfway covenant. And this is going to be one of the great theological issues of the day. And it's something that any culture or society where Christianity is in ascendancy and most people are Christian are going to have to deal with. They're going to have to answer these questions. And it has to do with this. What do you do with someone who's been baptized into Christ, but maybe from infancy, raised in the faith, but they're not converted? Maybe even by their own admission. We're not talking about Timothy Edwards like, I'm peering into your soul, you think you're converted, but I say you're not. We're talking about someone who's like, yeah, I'm Christian, but I've never really, I don't really feel that guilty about my sin. It's not that big of a deal. What do you do? It's in some ways fairly easy for us to answer in our society because that person would have a lot of trouble wanting to go to our church here in the Pacific Northwest, such that this is really important. I'm going to pretend and do this thing. It's like, peace out. I want nothing to do with this. And you put us in a boat factory in the cold, and they peaced out a long time ago. But if they hadn't, they're definitely peacing out then. But now you're at a point where Christianity it's the expected religion of everybody. And if you are going to occupy any position in society, if you are going to have any good rapport with your neighbors, you'd better be Christian. That's the nature of society at this time. As we saw earlier, if you remember last week, every single state had established state churches, but a few. That tells you how serious it was to be Christian. You couldn't run for office in a congregational state if you were not Congregationalist. That's kind of a big deal. You're cut off. And so now there really is a felt need to be Christian, even if you haven't experienced any sort of conversion. But what does this make for? A scenario that you might say of cultural Christianity. That's what it's often called. And there are some benefits to that, and there's some terrible dangers to that. People thinking maybe that their salvation is secure, or maybe never thinking about their salvation at all just because they're Christian. And so people wanting to have societal influence, they want to retain membership in the church. They don't want to sit down with the pastor and think about what we do. Anyone who became a member at Trinitas Church, we sat down with you and said, tell us your story. How did you end up here? How did you get saved? In turn, how did you find Trinitas Presbyterian? How did you become Reformed? Or maybe you're still kind of iffy on certain things, but we're going to ask you to tell us your story. Well, what if you're like, honestly, I don't want to even pretend. I'm not having that story. I'll show up at church, and then even more importantly, I want to have my kids baptized. That is going to be the heart of the issue for the halfway covenant. Now, here's the thing. Stoddard has essentially struck a chord in Northampton for how to handle all this. At the end of the day, the requirements for becoming a member of the church are pretty slim. Not much is going to go on in Stoddard's Northampton to make sure that you're a baptized convert who really believes in Jesus. He's going to preach it, he's going to talk about that, but he's not going to require the same level of intense interview. And he is going to allow the children of baptized unconverted, to be baptized as well. And that is going to be what the halfway covenant is. And let me explain why they call it the halfway covenant. If you look at this right here, when you think about salvation and you think about church membership, we would note that for most people, if you have a circle of people who are saved and converted, and you have a circle of people who are members of a visible church, we'd say most Christians fall right here. They're saved and they're members of a visible church. They're in both of those circles. But we know of exceptions to all of this. Judas and Simon Magus clearly belonged by externals to the disciples of Christ, to the church, and Simon was baptized, but we all know they don't fall into the red circle of those who are saved, right? That's rather clear from the Bible. Okay, we also know of people who get saved, but they're never baptized. They never attend a single Christian church service. You think of the thief on the cross. He goes to the cross, cursing Jesus, and somehow in the course of time on the cross, he gets saved, but he never joins the local church. He doesn't even experience, again, baptism, the Lord's Supper. It wouldn't appear that even in his Jewish life, he was a very good, Jewish believer, hence the thief on the cross. But also early Christian martyrs. There'd be people who see the witness of a martyr who's getting killed, and they're like, oh man, I believe that. And shortly after, they say, I believe that, and they're killed before they ever go to a Christian service, before they ever get baptized. And we go, they're saved, they're converted, but they never became a member of the visible church. Okay, so you got those categories, right? This is most Christians. They're both, members of a church and saved. So the halfway covenant deals with this guy right here. And if this was a Venn diagram, he's on the line because they're like, he's baptized, which is, a sign and seal of salvation by faith. But if you don't have the very faith that it signifies, then you're in a lot of trouble. And so you have someone who's baptized as an adult or an infant. Maybe they're baptized as an adult just due to social pressure. They don't really ever believe it. Well, what we would say is a baptized infant, we'd go, until you profess faith, we're not going to invite you to the Lord's table. Likewise, if someone says, I'm a baptized adult, and I'm like, all right, yeah, that's great. What's the gospel? That's another question we ask at a new member interview. And they're like, the gospel is good people go to heaven and bad people go to hell. We'd be like, sorry, bud, that's not how it works, and we're not going to have you come to the Lord's table. Well, a lot of people in Solomon Stoddard's day would be like, yeah, I probably shouldn't come to the table. I'm going to come to church. I'm Christian, but, I I don't know if I could articulate the gospel or what it is or what I actually believe. I don't know if I really want to. But I kind of do want my children to get baptized because I want them to come to church with me and I don't want them to be social outcasts. And what do you say, Solomon? And in Solomon Stoddard's Northampton, those kids could be baptized, but the question would be, what are they? Are these kids to be counted as members of the church when their parents don't have a living faith? Should they be baptized and counted as members of the church, or should they be regarded as unbelievers, no less Christian, no less even bound for salvation than any unbeliever, because their parents have no intention to nurture them in the faith? That's the question. Now, to complicate the question is the fact that we have verses like this. Some prophecy about the New Covenant. My words which I have put in your mouth shall not depart from your mouth, nor from the mouth of your offspring, nor from the mouth of your offspring's offspring. That is not just your children. That's your grandchildren. So if this parent right here, who got baptized in infancy, but doesn't necessarily believe, what if their grandparents absolutely do believe? They are hardcore believers. They profess the faith. They've been converted. This prophecy would seem to suggest that your children's children, on account of this relationship, gives you a right to baptism and membership in the covenant. Same thing with the second commandment. Yeah, that God would show his loving kindness to thousands of generations. What do you guys think Calvin said? Calvin actually answered questions about this. What do you guys think he said about the baptism of these people right here with that kind of parent? Calvin said you could baptize them. He said you should. See, part of it is they have a sense of a Christian society that none of us do. We just don't. You could actually probably have the sense that your grandchildren, your children, if they have a believing grandfather, all their playmates at school are Christian, everyone in their life is Christian, you'd probably have the sense that it'd be pretty hard to resist the influence and the nurture of Christianity on them. No one would think that in our society. And that's one of the reasons why I'd say this is a disanalogous situation for us as Christians today, because we have no such reinforcement at every level. Well, that is what the halfway covenant is. It's really clear that God's in covenant with all those who are saved and those who are in his church and those who are saved. But what is this? It's kind of like this guy's kind of halfway in the covenant, even though he himself is an unbeliever and outside of the church. He's kind of halfway in it because his parents are in it, and his kids are kind of halfway in it the moment they're born. And they'd say that's kind of the scenario. Well, Edwards didn't like any of this. Edwards is an opponent to the halfway covenant. Like his father, Timothy, he wants people to have a real conversion experience before they're admitted to the Lord's table and before their children are admitted to baptism. You guys got it? This is the big question of cultural Christianity and how you deal with it. Well, that's going to get him into trouble in the course of time, as you're going to see. But I want to talk about the moral decline in Northampton. So everybody's Christian, right? Some people are really Christian, but everybody's Christian with the air quotes. Well, there's vast moral decline throughout New England in this period. This is the period prior to the Great Awakening. Fornication was rampant. Numerous children would be born illegitimately, and they said that very frequently a baby would be born 3 months after a couple got married. And this was something, of a epidemic in the land at the time. And they would practice this thing called bundling, which who ever thought of this? It's not like today where you come into town and you go stay at the hotel or something like that if you're away from home or you name it. In fact, you might have to walk great distances from one house to another. So the idea of needing to stay the night at someone else's house, a little bit more regular. But the question of how you would do that if maybe there was a romantic interest in a daughter or, with a boy across the way who came by, well, he could stay the night only if they would bundle, which is they would wrap you up in some sort of sheet or blanket, and then they'd either sew it shut or it'd be really tight, and then you could sleep in the same bed next to the girl you were courting. Surprisingly, or not surprisingly, this contributed to the issue of children born illegitimately and, led to all sorts of issues at the time. Moreover, in the world at this time, this is where secularism a worldview where God is not in control or even necessarily a part of your life in any meaningful way is on the rise for the first time, really in Western history. Some of the biggest philosophers in the world are deists. Some of them are agnostic. Some of them are atheistic. And the other thing is there's just wealth on a scale for the masses as there's just never been before. You can read Jesus' parables, right? The seed that falls in the thorny places, it grows up, but it just gets choked by the world. Worldliness, you could say, is on the rise. And so Ben Franklin is the poster child of that. He was born in a congregational home just like Jonathan Edwards. Brilliant, just like Jonathan Edwards. Two completely divergent courses in life. Franklin, taking what you'd consider to be a much more pragmatic view of life and, what's going to work for me, and self-made man sort of a vision of reality. So that's what's going on in Northampton. So how's that going to work with a guy like Jonathan Edwards, who's extremely principled and himself just a force to be reckoned with? Well, at first, it's going to go somewhat well. Most people at this time are at minimum superstitious. They have some vision of powers beyond what we can understand scientifically. So when things like earthquakes happen, like the October 29th earthquake, 1727, what you have are people who are going to go, oh no, that was the Lord. He's not pleased with something. And even if you were kind of one of those guys in the halfway covenant, unconverted, that could work to your conversion. That could work to you going, I really believe there's supernatural things at work in the world. Well, in 1734, a young man gets an illness and dies in 2 days. And he was full health before that. He was one of those guys who everybody thought was fine, and he was apparently a pretty lively, charismatic character. And so Jonathan Edwards preaches his sermon. I'm surprised I didn't actually put the verse out here. It's in Psalm 90 where God contrasts his own eternity with the life of men. And this is going to be the beginnings of revival in Northampton. And so Psalm 90 puts it this way, verses 5-6. You have swept them away like a flood. They fall asleep. In the morning they are like grass which sprouts anew. In the morning it flourishes and sprouts anew. Toward evening it fades and withers away. Speaking about how quickly human life can be lost. And when Edwards preaches on this, he gets intense emotional responses from the congregation. And this is wrapped up with other wild things that are going on. Someone in a neighboring town commits suicide, and actually in 1735, there's a craze of suicides, a mass, craze of this sort of behavior, and people are crediting this to the devil as a response to the sort of awakenings that are happening in people's soul, him attacking people in obviously negative ways spiritually at the time. So Edwards actually writes an account of what's going on in New England, and he's just one thing on the scale of what's going on in New England when it comes to revival and awakening, to Isaac Watts. Isaac Watts, Before the Throne of God Above. That's an Isaac Watts hymn. He was a great hymn writer. And Edwards has various correspondences with him throughout his life. He actually tells Isaac Watts that he thinks that maybe the millennium, Christ's special reign and glory and the ascendancy of his kingdom on earth is going to happen in America. And Watts is in England. He gets ticked off by that. He's like, dude, you're out of your mind. He's like, you're too wrapped up in this whole thing. But in any case, what happens is at one point, Edwards goes down to a neighboring city, to Enfield. And right across the river in Suffield, it's a neighboring city, there had just been revival. Well, he goes to Enfield with a preaching ministry and expects to see something in the same way. See, the week before he got to Enfield in Suffield, 97 people became new communicants, which meant they hadn't just been baptized in infancy or at some point in their Christian life, but they have a response to the gospel and they say, we believe, and they are admitted as new communicants. Well, this was attended by moaning, shaking, fainting, things like that in that congregation. Well, Edwards goes to the neighboring city to preach what is his most famous sermon, and it's Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. He actually preaches this sermon more than once. But on this occasion, Edwards doesn't even get to the end of the sermon before a woman stands up in the middle of the service and just says, "What shall I do to be saved?" And like right then and there, there's a vast response, an intense emotional response to this gospel preached. And many people are again, having a similar experience as in Suffield. They're believing the gospel. And man, it's a sermon you'll find throughout the Great Awakening where there was no shortage of talk about eternal judgment in hell. And you're going to find that this is even going to make some conservative people in congregational and Presbyterian circles uneasy with how frequently hellfire is being spoken. Sadly, Edwards gets remembered for this, like this is the one, sermon that defines Jonathan Edwards. And, he does talk a great deal about hell in it, talks about the, concept of man just hanging over eternal fire by a thread, and essentially this gospel preaching as your lone freedom from this dangerous plight that you're in. So it's at this time when George Whitefield comes on the rise. And to put it in perspective, George Whitefield is the most famous man in the world at this time, barring someone in the Orient who is more famous that I don't know about. But I'm going to say very clearly in the Western world, he's unparalleled in his fame. Now, Whitefield is an Anglican in England, which is funny because he's going to be the most famous man in America. He is part of a group of people. He, in his early life, crosses paths with John and Charles Wesley, who are going to be the founders in the beginnings of Methodism, or the Methodist Church. And seeing this sort of like cold stagnancy in a formal liturgy inside the Anglican Church, these men begin Bible study societies. Guys, frankly, if you go to a small group, you do a weekly Bible study, anything like that, you really can kind of thank the Methodists for this. This is, in ages past, to be honest with you, you would work 6 days a week, and you probably would not have time, especially as a serf, who's working these horrible hours to do anything in the evenings. Methodism is something that can only really arise in a more modern society, and we're all thankful that it is. We're kind of, like Methodists right now, although it's the Lord's Day, which is the one time you probably would be able to have studied beyond whatever your vocation was, even before this time. Well, John and Charles Wesley, they are themselves a force to be reckoned with, although their initial trip to America is actually in the southern states to Savannah, and it doesn't go very well. They have to return home somewhat broke, and their ministry efforts not having had in their first trip much of an effect. But when they return to England, that's actually when they come into contact with Whitefield, and they become significantly more successful in their efforts and labors. And all of this is tied to revivals in England as well. And George Whitefield is originally an Anglican minister who, upon arrival in London, where he was known for just being an extremely powerful speaker who would evoke rather incredible responses, when he gets to London, they won't let him preach in the church. The more you consider it musty, conservatives don't appreciate it. So he preaches outside. And this is going to be the beginning of outdoor revivals. He goes, all right, fine, I'll go outside. And he preaches outside, and masses of people are responding to his ministry. Well, he is going to come to America, and he will be at Northampton and warmly received by Jonathan Edwards in 1740. The Presbyterians, who we'll talk about next week, the tenants in the middle colonies, particularly in Pennsylvania, they are also going to be huge facilitators for George Whitefield. But probably the most is going to be Benjamin Franklin, which is surprising. We'll see why. But George Whitefield, his first trip to the Americas, it's going to be in Savannah, where the Wesleys had gone before him. And he also is going to, for the duration of his ministry, He's going to constantly be raising money for an orphanage that he founds there. So this is bound up with other mercy ministry projects. But on his second trip, 1740s, that's when he makes his way to Northampton. And I believe he arrives, he arrives in New York. He does a kind of a southern trip up through Philadelphia, back north, and then finally to Northampton. And he loves the Edwards. He talks about both Jonathan Edwards and Sarah as being remarkably pious people. But if you look at Edward Whitfield's life, it's unbelievable. He makes 7 trips to the Americas in a time when, you think about flights being 12 hours. But 7 trips to America, and frankly, this man is basically preaching 7 days a week wherever he is on planet Earth. So he preaches in the colonies in Bermuda in his 3rd trip in the 1740s. When he gets home, he's preaching in England, Wales, Ireland, Scotland. He gains wide acceptance at this point, and now the Anglicans decide they like him. They didn't like him before that, but now it's like you can't not like this man who's, again, at this point, probably the most famous person in the world. So he goes back to Georgia in the 1750s. Upon return, he returns to England to fundraise, again, for that Georgia orphanage. But again, he preaches in Wales and Edinburgh and London, and he's preaching night after night after night after night. He's known for spontaneous preaching. That is just taking up a text and preaching it. Again, he makes another trip to the Americas, New England, Georgia. This guy's on the move all the time. He gets an honorary master's degree from the College of New Jersey, which is really Princeton, which is, again, a Presbyterian organization. Back in the UK, to New York, New England, London, Edinburgh, just again and again, where he actually passes away is in Newburyport, Massachusetts. Some people would say that George Whitefield is the founding father of America, but prior to any political individual whatsoever. And 6,000 people attended his funeral. If you guys read in the text, you might have seen it said that it's estimated that George Whitefield preached the gospel to more people on planet Earth than anyone in human history, including Billy Graham. Especially if you're talking about live preaching, definitely than Billy Graham. I mean, no question about it. I mean, the thing that would put Billy Graham over the top would be the televised audiences. But that is just an incredible thing. If anyone ever tells you that Calvinism is antithetical to an evangelistic mindset, George Whitefield is the opposite of that. Whitefield had a big dispute with the Wesleys. As a Calvinist, they were Arminian, and he has a famous article to the effect that they err in their failure to accept the doctrines of grace. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I understand the funeral was quite a blowout. The funderal?
Oh, well, hey, thank you. Funderal, blowout fundraising. Thank you for that. Here's the thing, guys. With all of this, other questions arise about the effects of this. When the most famous person in the world is a minister, a preacher of the gospel, this does make for some very challenging things. And it's like, no one looking back can go, boy, we're disappointed that multitudes and multitudes heard the gospel. But never in human history was fame perhaps quite so profoundly married to oratory skills as a Christian preacher. And what this makes for is an uneasiness which is understandable. First of all, they're innovations. Outdoor preaching in a big tent, calling everyone around you, calling everyone from everybody else's church around you to go and be a part of this event. Well, that's great if it's Whitefield and he has awesome theology, but what about if some other guy comes to town who is a great speaker and wants to preach and everybody shows up? You can imagine why that'd be a little bit concerning to ministers and preachers of all kinds. Moreover, this is something that almost had never happened before in human history. Following the Great Awakening, the ability of congregants to challenge clergy, their own pastors, ministers, and elders, for not being maybe themselves converted, for not maybe themselves being really all that on fire for the Lord. The ability of congregants to challenge their own ecclesiastical authority really is something that rarely would occur in the history of Christianity up until this point. And we are beginning to see the rise of the individual, the rise of democratic societies, and it cannot help but to also appear in the church. In fact, it appears in the church before it appears in society. What's going to happen within 25 years of this Great Awakening is what? The most radical revolutionary challenge to English authority in the colonies. And people couldn't help but to see this connection. In a way, you like cancel culture? In a way, you get enough people at Whitfield's rally who see what a passionate preacher could be like. They could all leave and go, we decided our preacher isn't passionate. We're going to quit going to church there. Canceled. Not quite as aggressive, but that's the sort of thing that could occur at the time, and it made the church uneasy. To be honest, Whitfield did believe, and many of these revival preachers did believe, that they could, upon encountering a person, immediately tell if they're really converted. That's a bit dangerous. Maybe someone's having a bad day. Maybe someone's just not as enthused as you are in that moment about what you're talking about. And these are the kinds of things that eventually became somewhat problematic. Well, Benjamin Franklin helped to publicize George Whitfield with his particular newspaper, and he loved it because he was a big show. And so for him, there was an incentive to rally people to these rallies, get everybody excited, because he would sell more newspapers. And of course, Benjamin Franklin loved it. He loved Whitfield. He felt like Whitfield himself was something of a self-made man like he was, albeit in a different sphere. One of the classic stories is that Benjamin Franklin would go to Whitfield's preaching outdoors, and someone asked him once, why do you go and hear this preacher? You don't believe anything he's saying. And his classic response was, I don't go because I believe it. I go because it's clear he believes it. And you could see that, something was really intriguing about seeing this man's passion, and of course it was just a way of life. Well, I'll just mention the tenets in passing. These are going to be some of the main Presbyterians involved in this movement. But they preach a sermon, the younger of the two, The Danger of an Unconverted Ministry, where he talks about the danger of pastors who don't really have saving knowledge of God. And to be honest, it's not entirely out of line. You do have pastors at this time who are cultural Christians, and that is a grave danger in any church. Well, here's the other thing. There are abuses to this revivalism, as anyone who's been involved in revivalistic sorts of Christianity knows. Here's one example. Itinerant preacher James Davenport, he's one of ours, he's a Presbyterian. He's preaching revivalistic style outdoors in New London, Connecticut. He's getting real fired up. In fact, they begin a book burning. And what books do they start burning? Old Puritan books that people count to be musty and stale. And guess what, guys? You're nuts if you think that the Puritans had a stale, lifeless religion. Like, you've really gone off the tracks somewhere. As the preaching continues, he explains that we need to quit wearing all this worldly clothing. And at that moment, Mr. Davenport himself feels convicted by something to take off his own clothing and throw it in the fire. I want you to think about, what does this actually look like? You have a big bonfire outside and a naked preacher there. Does this look like the worship of the holy God, or does this look more like the worship of some pagan deity? Later, he actually admits, he goes, yeah, I was clearly under the influence of an evil spirit at that moment. I will have you know, Davenport actually is a moderator of one of the Presbyterian assemblies, general assemblies, in the course of our existence as an American Presbyterian church. So just put that in your pocket. Another example of this would be Bathsheba Kingsley. If you remember the story in the Gospels, Jesus is like, hey, go into this town. There's going to be like house ready for you. We're going to have the Lord's Supper. It's like all these, and it's like, it doesn't tell you how that's the case, whether Jesus, knows beforehand as by way of miracle, or maybe he even made plans. Well, she steals a horse to go to a neighboring town to evangelize, and that didn't go over very well. You imagine a horse, someone steals your car, you wouldn't be too pleased with that in the name of gospel preaching. There are numerous instances like this, and the revival side kind of has to admit it. Like, we want people to be saved. We don't want stale religion, but dude, this is nuts. And these sorts of things are going on. Well, I'll give some others. Some people begin to neglect ordinary ministry altogether. Don't go to church. They're living life on the revival tent preaching. That's not going to do you well any more than, constantly every day being, exciting and fun. You're not going to have a job if you live that way. You're not going to be able to have normal life. Moreover, congregants being adversarial toward their own ministers, big problem. Maybe you think, hey, Whitfield went out and preached open air. Forget it. I'm going to do the same thing. Based on what calling? Because I feel inclined. People with that mentality forget that Whitfield was ordained. That's entirely different than you just going out and doing your own thing. But this sort of stance is increasingly occurring. Actually, it's going to loan itself to a Baptist view of the church and ministry, where you don't have an ordination necessarily from some bigger body. Your giftedness alone might be sufficient. And so, of course, unvetted preachers. It's a dangerous thing. This is why it's called the First American Revolution. This is the sort of American cowboy mentality first making appearance in religion. Well, Edwards, he takes up the task of defending the revivals. And he does so very carefully. He is not an unfettered defender of these behaviors without any sort of breaks. He writes 2 works, several works really. The Religious Affections is his most mature, but there are several precursors to it. A Faithful Narrative, which is obviously more of a history, some thoughts on revival, and in his Yale commencement speech, he actually speaks favorably of it, which was a dangerous thing to do at Yale in 1741, because the faculty there are getting challenged by the students for not having a real conversion. Can you understand that? What if you set foot in Harvard Divinity School today, or Yale Divinity School? How many of us would feel inclined to be like, look, dude, I don't care how much you've read. Like, if you don't believe this stuff, you're not the right teacher of it. One particular student, David Brainerd, we'll talk about later, Edwards has a real affection for him, but he had a falling out at Yale. And so here's Edwards' defense. I want to be clear about a few things. Edwards is very clear cessationist. He does not believe that people can speak the prophetic word of God anymore. He does not believe that currently people can work miracles the way that Jesus and the disciples did in this immediate sense. That's not to say he didn't believe that miraculous things could occur, but he had serious doubts about miracle workers, alleged healers, you name it. And he's a cessationist. But what he does want to talk about is physical enthusiasm. And he wants to say 2 things. He's really clear. Just because someone has had a physical, enthusiastic response to the gospel does not mean they've had a real conversion. That's not enough. The fact that you cried a bunch, the fact that you had tears, the fact that you had jubilant, expressions of joy and praise, that's not proof that you really have saving relationship with Christ. But he's going to say this too. Those things are not to be despised just because they're potentially disruptive from time to time. And so he expounds 12 signs in the course of this work that a revival was real. But it's really going to emphasize this. A revival is real not because there's been physical enthusiasm, but because the fruit of it is a life of humility. It's going to be one sign. You're not going to come out more proud on the other side of that. So think about, anyone ever seen revival preaching? Was humility an overwhelming virtue? Edwards is going to say that is just sure proof that you don't have a real revival going on. Real good works flowing from that. Sadly, how many American revivals result in a minister who has some sort of impropriety with money in particular? It's not really in the good works category. It should increase your love of God and neighbor over experience. I'll just say, I've been in ministry experiences that have had thousands of people become part of the church, and it's like, some of the main leaders they're just flat out jerks. There's not really any other way to put it. They're just mean people. and they have a long list of really horrible behaviors to others. Edwards is going to say this is indicative that that's not genuine revival. And the main thing is flat out going to be endurance. But here's the problem. How does that help me in this moment at this tent revival to know if this is real? If I have to wait and see, how long, do we have to wait and see if it's endured? As you're going to see, Edwards himself, especially in his mature ministry, is really, really saddened by how little endurance there is. And that is going to be one of the classic, critiques of revivalism in general, and going to continue to be. Edwards' defense, he has to go up against this guy named Charles Chauncey. He was a super anti-revivalist. He's First Church in Boston. It's a congregational church. And Chauncey, dude, he is a precursor to Unitarianism. That's denial of the Trinity. He's a precursor to Universalism, that denial that anyone's going to hell. So no, I don't want to hear your hellfire preaching and see people, genuinely converted. No, I don't want to hear about the exclusivity of Christ. This is just pure cultural religion at this point. Who the heck is this guy? You don't believe in the Trinity and the absolute necessity of Christ to be saved. Well, what the heck religion is that? It's not Christianity. And that's a perfect example of why you could see Jonathan Edwards going, if this is the face of the opposition, I know what side I'm on. Pro-revival. If this is anti-revival, I'm pro-revival. We're all pro-revival, if that's the other option. And that's, why you have the response that you do. Well, as noted, there's going to be some drama in all of this. Post-revival backsliding is really, really intensely depressing for Edwards. You think you're seeing just incredible, and you marry it to, again, an optimistic eschatology. You think, man, we're right there. Maybe this is going to be we're going to enter this age of just intense belief. And it's like, man, very shortly you see people start to backslide. He's also known for being kind of a hermit. He spends a lot of time in his study, and people don't like that. They want him to be more of a, they want him to be more of a socialite in this aristocratic society. And the word has it that when he's around people, he's plenty pleasant, but he's deep in thought all the time. And some people don't like that. But here's the other thing. They definitely feel like he's overly strict. There are numerous instances I could tell you about, but the Red Book incident would be a perfect example. Apparently in Northampton, a guide to female anatomy, which is really more of a science textbook, starts getting passed around. It's the closest thing to pornography that exists at the time. And as a result, there's secret groups of boys, looking at this thing, and young men, teenagers and stuff. And it actually starts to produce a culture of making lewd jokes, things like that. Edwards gets wind of it. And this is definitely a strategic blunder. He's going to deal with this, that's for sure. And he stands in a position to do that. Well, after his sermon one Sunday in 1744, he gets up and he goes, listen, I've heard about this whole Red Book thing. I know all about it. So here's what's going to go down. I want these people to show up after church, and we're going to have a talk. Well, Edwards lists everybody in the church, not only who is thought to be a perpetrator of this, passing around of this book and, these lewd jokes are resulting from it, but also everyone who's a victim. And he makes no distinction. He says, so all the young ladies who have been, in some way or another treated with impropriety on account of this whole Red Book incident, all names are listed all at once. I want to talk to all of you afterwards. So it's just, the whole town is like, good grief, this is scandal. It's like, why did my daughter get mentioned? And my son actually wasn't passing around the book. He was defending his sister. It's like, dude, everyone is ticked. And I think by almost any standard you go, yes, that probably should have been dealt with. But publicly, from the pulpit afterwards, there are other people who haven't had an intense conversion experience as some people feel the need to have. And some actually come to Edwards and they're like, look, I've been seeking, some sort of more intense, experience with the Lord for years. What's the deal? And it is felt as if Edwards wasn't exactly pastoral when he said, you should just be grateful that you have even been present to hear the word of God preached. And you shouldn't be, and he really kind of lays into them for, their their lack of gratitude, even in spite of their failure to have experienced anything enthusiastic. But Edwards is just intense. That's all there is to it. But the other thing is, it's going to be just the other conflicts that are going on in the world are going to weigh heavily on him. War is, as we know, it's going to be not 50 years before the Revolutionary War. But in the 1740s, King George of England, he gets the colonists into a war. King George's War is far too hard to explain, but because of an issue with the kings in Prussia, essentially England's at war with the Germans, and somehow France is aligned with the Germans, and the French are up in Canada, and the colonists from England are down in America, what will be the United States. And so they're at war. And so the people, the colonists in New England, actually have to go to war at the behest of King George, and they go and attack Louisbourg Fortress in Nova Scotia. I've got a map here. Because, Canada's French, essentially, and at that time anyways, and the English are at war with them. And so a militia of colonists go up to fight a battle where they have really no chance by most measures, and they actually win the battle. But John Stoddard, that's Edwards's brother-in-law after his marriage, he's a big military guy in Massachusetts, and you can imagine how invested you are in this. Think about when anyone who went to Iraq, Afghanistan? Well, that's an Atlantic Ocean and a continent away. This is just up the St. Lawrence River from you. But Edwards is rallying people to pray and fast for American victory, all of it, and they do get that. But here is the mentality of the growing secular population. Somebody go ahead and read this Benjamin Franklin quote.
I fear I shall have but an indifferent opinion of Presbyterian prayers. In attacking towns, I should have more dependence on works than on faith.
Nice little slight on the doctrine of justification by faith alone. For war, I'll take works. No. Well, apparently, these prayers did fuel a victory, but that's pretty intense. There are constant conflicts, not only with other nations, but we'll see with the Indians in a little bit. Moreover, slavery is an issue at this time. We should note Edwards was very much opposed to the transatlantic slave trade. However, he did defend slavery as an institution wherein someone either had a debt or someone had committed a crime of theft or something like that, and essentially you would work to pay off and make restitution for whatever you had done. But that was just commonplace at the time. But again, he did oppose racism as well. There was a local minister, I believe, that he wrote against his treatment of his slaves. And we'll note that Edwards did own at least 2 slaves. But for example, one of them, Leah, was communed in 1734 at a revival in Northampton where he was. And notably, Native and American members could vote in congregational meetings if they were, converted communed believers. And these are significant things, yeah.
Native African.
Yes, natives, and then, yes, of course, Native Americans and Africans. But the Indian relations were also intense. Edwards' aunt and cousin were both killed by Indians, usually at the behest of the French if they were at war with the English. That's usually how the Indians would get involved in various military conflicts. But here's an example of something that was just frightening to people. A local minister named Reverend Williams, his daughter was captured by the Indians. And then she was married to one of the Indian men who generally, if they embraced Christianity, would embrace Roman Catholicism because it was so similar to their tribal religion, had lots of smells and bells. And that was just frightening to people. It was frightening. Like, your daughters could be captured and then be taken into a religion that is kind of half pagan, half Roman Catholic, neither of which you wanted to be at the time. Frightening. Well, David Brainerd was a young man who actually ended up being engaged to one of Edwards' daughters. Remember, he was at Yale, and he opposed kind of the dry, lifeless faculty. Well, he was himself a missionary to the Lenape Indians in New Jersey. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, but Edwards stopped writing one of his greatest philosophical works and theological works called The Freedom of the Will to write the life of David Brainerd because of the regard he had for this man and the way that he put his life in danger to be a missionary to the Indians. And you'll see it's going to be a big part of Edwards' life as well. Well, here's what happens. Due to the halfway covenant business, what ends up happening is after all of this stuff that's going on, Edwards increases the bar for what it takes to become a member. More intense membership interview, more intense signing on to doctrine. People do not like it. And despite all that Edwards did, despite the revival that took place in the town, they have a vote. And only 23 of 230 people who are voting vote to retain him as minister, and he's relieved of his position in 1750, dismissed. At which point, Jonathan Edwards said, I always did like Presbyterian polity more than Congregationalists. So that's another one for the Presbyterians, all right? It's another one. He felt like if there had been a presbytery perhaps who had his back, he might have kept his job, I think. I think that's what he was thinking. There'd be a more formal inquiry into things. But in Congregationalism, you really are kind of at the mercy of the congregation. So, throw it out there. Well, this leads to his second ministerial call, last ministerial call. And he's going to go deeper into the wilderness, into the west to Stockbridge. Stockbridge is just, you're on the outskirts of all civilization. And in his Stockbridge pastorate, it is the Mohican mission above all else that is kind of the beginnings of this town, really. And what happens is that in the course of his time there, his son, Jonathan Jr., because he's a young man and plays with the Mohican kids at the Mohican mission, he learns their language. At the age of 10, this young man gets sent with missionaries deeper into Mohican territory with a view to seeing them converted. And Edwards writes his 10-year-old son a letter and writes, "Be prepared to die." That's intense. Think about sending my son at 10 because he could speak the language and he could translate, which is often the case if you're immersed in another language in another society. So this is the world of Jonathan Edwards. You're trying to get a sense of how hardcore he is. That's how hardcore. Well, Jonathan Jr. actually does grow up to be something of a theologian in his own right. And the last of the Mohicans, that's obviously about this people in this tribe that actually there is substantial inroads to Christianity with them in the course of time. At this Stockbridge pastorate, here's the thing. Edwards actually figures out that because it's a lot smaller church, he actually can do what he's always wanted to do, which is write and write and write. And he does that. And this is when he writes some of his main theological, right on the cusp of theology and philosophy works of all time. The most famous of which, by far, is The Freedom of the Will. I'll talk about it in a moment. But also The Nature of True Virtue. Edwards wants to oppose this increased enlightenment idea that's embraced throughout the world that you can just be a good person, have virtues apart from Christ, have virtues apart from the Holy Spirit. He's vehemently opposed to that. Also writes The End for Which God Created the World, the purpose of this whole thing governed by Newtonian laws and all of the most modern visions of science and understanding the world. But I'll talk to you for a moment about The Freedom of the Will. R.C. Sproul, John Gerstner, people you like, they loved Jonathan Edwards. As noted, generally regarded as America's greatest philosopher, and the full title of The Freedom of the Will is A Careful and Strict Inquiry into the Modern Notions of that freedom of the will, which is supposed to be essential to moral agency, virtue and vice, reward and punishment, praise and blame. That is a classic title. Could have been written by a Puritan. Some say Jonathan Edwards was the last of the Puritans. Technically, to be a Puritan, you have to be a person in England trying to purify the Church of England, and he wasn't that. So, but he was of the same vein. What is this book about? Here's what it's about. Increasingly, there is this idea that to be really virtuous, to be really responsible, to really be worthy of a reward, your decisions must be decisions that flow from what you might call autonomous freedom. The idea that no one is governing that choice but you, and that whatever choice you make, you genuinely could have chosen differently. And the thought is that if you had to choose any given choice, then that would destroy the idea of virtue. It would destroy the idea that anyone could be rewarded or punished because you had to do whatever you chose to do. Well, Edwards is going to take on that idea. And this is his most famous treatise. It's his most studied. And I'll try to give you some sense of what it says with a brief synopsis. Here it is. There's 4 parts. And the first part has much to do with definitions, but one of the main distinctions that Edwards is going to have there is between something he'd call natural inability and moral inability. And here's what I mean by this. You all had a natural inability to swim across the Pacific Ocean. That is to say, regardless of what you want to do, you will never be able to swim across the Atlantic Ocean by your own bare human flesh alone. You just can't do it. Likewise, you have a natural inability to change your gender despite what people say today. You can't do that. You have a real biology to you. Moral inability, by contrast, is the inability to do something that you are totally disinclined to doing. That is to say, the inability to do what you fundamentally do not want to do. And there are all sorts of areas of life where we could think about this. And like maybe, for example, someone gives you a hatchet and says, chop off your hand. And you're just like, and there's just this, I'm so disinclined at the core of my being, I just can't do it. There's a study done once of people trying to pee fully clothed. Believe it or not, it's a lot harder to do than you might think it is. And it's this sort of thing where it's like, it's a mental thing. There's nothing logically impossible about it, but you're so up against all of your natural social, constraints. And so what Edwards is going to say is that an unbeliever, a person who is not yet regenerated by the Spirit, he's going to say that it's not that they have a natural inability to believe. Belief is something that we do all the time. But they have a moral inability. They are so disinclined to the Lord. They have such a rebellious heart that the cannot that accompanies total depravity is a moral inability. It is because their will is totally disinclined against it. You see those two things? The difference between them? And then the second thing he's going to say in this beginning session is that everybody always does what you most of all want to do. And you got to ask yourself if you believe that. I remember when I worked at Daniel's Broiler, and I said this to one of my managers. He's like, that's not true. He's like, I didn't want to get up out of bed and go to work today, but I did. I'm like, well, clearly you wanted to do that more than you wanted to stay in bed because you didn't want to lose your job more than you wanted to have your slumber. And he's like, oh, well, one of those things. And he was a philosophy major too, but he wasn't a believer. So, but the idea is at the end of the day, one always does what he most wants to do. And this is where Edwards is going to say this is perfectly compatible with divine sovereignty and the idea that God can know the end from the beginning, and even that your choices are absolutely certain if you could know the whole of and the depths of your heart and your inclinations and desires. And so he's going to say there's actually no conflict between things being determined and at the same time things being the product of your free decision. Freedom doesn't mean, therefore, necessarily that one could have done otherwise. If by could you mean could have acted contrary to the deepest desire of their will. Now, he's going to go on and he's going to critique the Arminian theory, which you'd call libertarian freedom. He's actually going to say this: if it's really the case that your decisions flow from you, not because they're the deepest inclination of your will, but they flow from you without any prior cause or inclination in your soul, that in fact, then in that case, you cannot be responsible. Think of it this way. Suppose you have someone on the stand. There's been a murder right down in Mill Creek. We've got the suspect. And they say to the murderer, they say, you murdered this person in cold blood right down in the Mill Creek Town Center. He goes, yep, that's true. They're like, why did you do it? He goes, man, no reason. No reason at all. I just did. Would that person get convicted of murder, or would that person have a pretty solid case for insanity? if you could really convince a jury that you had absolutely no reason for killing someone. See, if your choices flow from you as like a random, flick of a coin, really, we're all just insane. Our choices flow from us as not expressions of our character or our person, but rather, instead, we're all just crazy. And how do you hold anyone responsible when we just produce such random choices? He also argues that Arminian, their vision of freedom is incompatible with divine foreknowledge. If it was really the case that what you're going to do tomorrow was not certain, and it's really possible you're going to do contrary to what you actually do, then he'd say there's no way to really foreknow the future. And Arminians have classically believed that, but it's going to be open theists who go, you're right. God must not actually know the future. And they kind of bite the bullet on that point. Well, the third section, he's going to argue that just because your choices flow from the deepest inclination of your will, it doesn't mean that they can't be praiseworthy or virtuous. In fact, he goes, if that were the case, then we couldn't call God virtuous. Is it possible for God to sin? No. All of his choices flow directly from his moral being. In fact, we'd say he's more holy because he can't sin, right? And he'll say the same thing about Jesus, and he'll say the same thing about the Good Samaritan. At the end of the day, the Good Samaritan, if his choice to have helped the man in need was just random and not actually an expression of his character, if he said, oh man, the reason I helped that guy, it was totally accidental. It was because, I was just walking along and, I dropped my wallet there and there he was and my money was in my wallet and I flicked him some money and I walked off. You wouldn't be like, man, that guy's really virtuous. But if he says, well, you know what? I really wanted to get to my destination. But even more so, I saw the image of God in that man. And I felt inclined to help him. You'd actually say that deep inclination of the will is virtue. You wouldn't say it's antithetical to virtue, that he was drawn like a magnet to help him. Does that make sense? Whereas if it was just random, you wouldn't look at it that way. Well, here's the thing, though. I want to be really clear. He answers objections at the end of his treatise, and this part is really important. Some would say if this is true, that we always do what we're most inclined to do, then it will make for apathy. Why pursue holiness? Why pursue good works? You have this idea you can only do what you're most inclined to do anyways. Well, Edwards goes, no. The only way you could ever come up with that is if you didn't love God and love the sovereignty of God and say, in fact, the beautiful thing is that I love the sovereignty of God and his grace and his nature so much that I'm deeply inclined to see it multiplied in myself and others. Only the person who says, I'm not really that interested in God in the first place is going to raise apathy as a potential implication of this philosophy. People who love divine sovereignty are just going to love to do what we saw in resolution number 23, which was see the wonderful sovereignty of God manifest in ourselves. Others would say, this sounds a lot like fatalism. No matter what you do, you have some destiny and you can't ever get away from it. He'll say, no, it's the opposite of fatalism. Fatalism says, no matter what you do, you're going to end up in some place in spite of your choices. Edwards goes, this is the opposite. I'm saying wherever you end up, you're going to end up there in accordance with your choices. That makes all of our choices valuable. Whereas fatalism says, you're destined to marry, some individual no matter what you do and what choice you make. That'd make you feel apathetic. But if rather God says, you are destined to make an impact for my kingdom, and it's going to happen through your evangelism. It's going to happen through your prayers. It's going to happen through your faithful labors. Now you have an inclination to labor hard and to labor for the kingdom. But here's the one thing I'll say. Edwards wants to make it really clear he's not saying that we're machines, where you have an electrical impulse to go this way, an electrical impulse to go that way. The bigger impulse makes you go that way. He's going to say how the inclinations of our will arise, where they come from, what they're like. It's not like material causation. It's something deeply mysterious. He'll say at the end of the day, maybe only God understands it. Maybe God only understands you in the deep inclinations of your will. But we have to say he understands it. And he even acknowledges, as for how Adam and Eve's will were ever inclined to sin, he goes, I don't know. It's impossible for me to say how that ever occurred in a human person, where there was no evil in the world, where they were made totally good, or how the devil fell. They're all made good. You'll say it's a mystery. But it's very important to note that Jonathan Edwards is comfortable with mystery. He's not a rationalist. He's not like the secular world. But he is going to say we need to interpret everything in light of God's word and what he's revealed to us. Well, the story ends like this. Edwards is called to be the president of Princeton Seminary, Presbyterian Seminary. Edwards dies a Presbyterian. Yes. Chalk it up on our team. All right. He's chosen, inaugurated 1757. His daughter is kind of married into the school and some of the bigwigs there. He's only there, inaugurated, for 3 months before there's a smallpox outbreak. And he's kind of like on the cutting edge of all science. And he realizes that statistically, people who got inoculated were more likely to live than those who didn't. But he gets the inoculation, vaccine, and he dies. He dies. Jonathan Edwards, he never finishes. He had this dream to write a systematic theology that was like simultaneously a telling of redemptive history from the point of Adam all the way to when he lived. That kind of incorporated the development of theology and all of it. Never got written. Sad story. And this is an old stamp of Nassau Hall, which is one of the main halls in Princeton. And so, as we'll see in our next lectures, there's kind of a string of deaths of presidents of Princeton until the great John Witherspoon. But that is the end of the story of Jonathan Edwards. Any questions from me, you guys? What a figure. A pastor, a theologian, a philosopher, revivals. Dude, eventually a university president. It's Jonathan Edwards. Boy, he's just all thunderstruck here. Not even Charlie. This is amazing. Yeah, it's like nothing. Yeah, she did. Sarah wrote a book, how to put up with a, what is it, like, or how to live with a difficult man. Yeah. It might have been, actually. I don't know. But, all right, well, we'll call it a day, guys. Thanks all for coming out, and we will jump into the Presbyterian tale of the 18th century next time.